The room was finished on a Tuesday. I know that because the concrete anchors I used came in a box of 50, and I had 4 left over, and I remember standing there in the dust with those 4 bolts in my palm, thinking I'd overbought. That was the last purely stupid thought I had for a long time. 4 bolts, $11. I was annoyed about $11. I want to say the room saved us. People have said that to me since, and I let them, because correcting them takes energy I don't have, and because the correction is complicated. The truth is that the room did exactly what I built it to do, and what I built it to do was the wrong thing. I spent 3 days and about $1,900 solving a problem that never showed up, and the problem that did show up walked right past my beautiful welded door frame and got in through the part I never thought about, which was the air and the water, and the fact that a sealed box needs somebody standing outside it. My name doesn't matter much for this. I ran a small fabrication business out of a leased bay in a light industrial strip on the north end of a mid-sized city, the kind of place with 9 identical roll-up doors in a row, a shared dumpster corral, and a gravel apron where everybody parked their work trucks nose out. Bay 4. I made handrails, stair stringers, custom brackets, gates, the occasional trailer repair. 14 years of it. My hands looked like the job. I built the room because of a woman named Corinne who used to work for me. That's the part I usually skip. It's easier to let people assume I was a prepper because preppers are a category, and categories don't require explanation. But I wasn't. I had a shop, a chop saw, a MIG welder, and a persistent low-grade fear that had nothing to do with disease. Corinne did my books and my quoting for 6 years. She left in the spring because her ex-husband had started showing up. First at her apartment, then at her sister's, then twice in my gravel lot at 7 in the morning, sitting in a white Silverado with the engine running, doing nothing, which is the whole point of doing nothing in a place you're not supposed to be. I called the non-emergency line both times. Both times a very tired officer explained to me what a public parking area was. So I built a room, 16 by 12 in the back corner of the bay where the old paint booth had been, using 2 existing block walls and adding 2 more out of steel stud and plate, with 3/4 ply on both faces and an air gap, which is not a bunker. It's just a wall that takes work to get through. Solid core door I salvaged off a bank remodel. Hung in a frame I welded myself out of 2x2 tube, 4 hinges, and a bar that dropped into 2 brackets. A little sink I plumbed off the shop's utility line. A cot, a space heater, a bar fridge, 1 window unit air conditioner and a punched opening near the ceiling because the room had no other ventilation and I'm not an idiot. I knew a sealed room gets hot and stale. Which was true, and which is why I put in the window unit, and which is why everything later went the way it did. That air conditioner ran on shop power. The shop power came from the pole outside. I understood that. I just never followed the sentence all the way to the end. Corinne never used the room. She moved to her cousin's place in another state at the end of May, and I finished the room anyway because I'd already bought the door and the studs, and because stopping felt like admitting the whole thing had been theater. I told my brother-in-law it was a tool crib. I told my landlord's property manager it was a paint storage enclosure, which got me a mild lecture about fire code and then nothing. 3 days from framing to the last bolt. Tuesday, 4 bolts left over. Friday morning the traffic on Kessler was wrong. I want to be careful here, because in hindsight everybody remembers the sky looking strange. It didn't. It was a normal, muggy morning in late August with that flat white overcast that doesn't cool anything down. What was wrong was specific and small. The left turn lane at Kessler and 9th was backed up past the auto parts store at 6:40 in the morning, and nobody was turning. I drove that intersection twice a day for 14 years. At 6:40, the left turn lane has maybe 4 cars, because the people turning left are going to the industrial strip, which is me and about 30 other guys. That morning it had 20, and the light cycled green arrow, and the first 3 cars went, and the rest didn't move. They just sat there with their brake lights on. I remember thinking somebody had stalled out. I remember looking to see where the stalled car was and not finding it, and then the light changed and I had my own lane to worry about, and I went to work. That's the first wrong thing. Not a siren, not an alert. 20 cars in a turn lane that shouldn't have had 20 cars, and no reason for it, and the specific texture of people who had already decided something and hadn't decided what came next. I unlocked Bay 4 at 6:51. I had a job on the bench 32 feet of pipe rail for a loading dock at a food distributor across town. Due Monday, half done. I put the radio on the classic rock station out of habit, and it was playing what it always plays. And I cut and coped and ground for about 2 hours before anything else registered. What registered was Dean. Dean ran Bay 7, HVAC service, 3 vans and 2 techs, and a wife who did his dispatch from home. Dean was in his shop by 6 every single morning of his life, and gone by 3 because he coached something. That Friday, his door was down at 9, and his truck wasn't in the lot, and neither were the vans. I texted him, "You good? Vans are out early." He didn't answer for 4 hours. When he did, he wrote, "Pulled the guys off. Not going into any building today. Long story." I read that maybe 6 times. Not going into any building today. That's a strange sentence from an HVAC guy. Buildings are the entire product. I typed 3 different replies and sent the 4th, which was, "Something at a job site?" He wrote back, "Had a call at Riverbend. Rehab place, tell you Monday." And I let it go. That's the thing I keep coming back to. I let it go because I had 32 feet of pipe rail due Monday, and because Dean was a guy who once refused to work at a house for 2 weeks because the homeowner's dog scared him, and because the alternative to letting it go was picking it up, and picking it up would have cost me the morning. At 11:40, I walked down to the corner market for a sandwich. That's a 4-minute walk past bays 5 and 6 and out to the frontage road. The market is one of those places with 2 aisles, a hot case and a Vietnamese family that has run it since before the strip was built. Mrs. Trin knew my sandwich. That day, her son was working the register instead, and there was a hand-lettered sign taped to the cooler door that said, "Cash only, card machine down," which happens, and the hot case was empty, which doesn't. The son said his mother hadn't come in. He said it in a way that made me not ask a second question. I paid cash. I had $31 in my wallet, and I remember counting it out and thinking I should hit the ATM. I didn't hit the ATM. That's mistake number 2, and it's a small one compared to what came later. But it stacked. Walking back, I passed Bay 6, a cabinet shop run by a man named Ruthford, who I'd never once seen not wearing safety glasses, even in the parking lot. And the door was up, and the lights were on, and nobody was inside. Not on break, empty. Machine still plugged in, coffee on the bench, empty. I stood in his doorway and called his name twice, and then felt foolish and went back to my rail. Here's my honest state of mind at noon on that Friday, mildly irritated. That's it. 3 things had happened that were slightly off, and my brain filed all 3 under other people's business, which is where I file most things, and always have. I am not a curious man. I'm a competent man, which is different, and in a lot of ways, worse. At 1:15, the power blinked. Not out. Blinked. That quarter-second drop where the lights dim and the welder's fan spins down and comes back, and the radio resets to its startup tone. It happened once, and then 11 minutes later, it happened again. And the second time, the shop compressor kicked on hard afterward, which is what compressors do when the pressure switch gets confused. I went outside and looked at the pole. You do that. There's nothing to see on a pole, but you look anyway. What I saw instead was the strip's shared lot, and there were 3 vehicles in it, and there are normally 15. It was 1:30 on a Friday. That was the moment. Not a phone call, not an alert, not a scream. A parking lot with 12 cars missing and me standing in gravel in August with a grinder shield pushed up on my forehead, doing arithmetic I didn't want to do. I went back inside and turned off the radio and got my phone out and did what everybody did that week, which is scroll. There wasn't much. There were 4 or 5 posts from local accounts about police activity at Riverbend, which was the name Dean had used, and one about a hospital diverting ambulances, and one from a woman complaining that her mother's care facility wasn't answering the phone. and 80 comments under it that were mostly people saying the same thing about different facilities. No news station had anything. The city's emergency page had a 2-day-old post about a water main. I called Dean. It rang and rang. I called my sister Alma, who lived about 20 minutes northwest with her husband and their kid, and she picked up on the second ring and said, "Are you at the shop?" "Yeah, okay." Long pause. "Ben's mother's place put out a thing. They're not doing visits." "Since when?" "Since this morning. They said it's respiratory." "Okay." "It's probably respiratory," she said, in a voice that was asking me to agree. "It's probably respiratory," I said. That's the whole conversation. That's my sister and me at 1:50 on the Friday, both of us handing the same sentence back and forth like it was a receipt we needed the other person to hold. I did not go home early. I want that on the record. I stayed and finished the second 12-foot section of that pipe rail because it was 90% done and because leaving it half-welded meant coming back to it cold. And I have never in my life been able to leave a weld half-run. I worked until 6:40. The power blinked twice more. On the way home, I stopped at the big grocery on Halstead, and it was busy but not insane, the kind of busy you'd get before a holiday weekend, which is exactly what people were telling each other it was. 2 women in the water aisle were laughing about it. There were still pallets of water. I bought 4 cases anyway, and some canned stuff, and a big bag of rice. And I felt self-conscious enough that I also bought charcoal and hot dog buns so it would look like a cookout. That's a thing I did. A grown man, 46 years old, buying decoy hot dog buns so a stranger in a checkout line wouldn't think he was panicking. I still had the buns 3 weeks later. They went green in the bag, and I threw them in the dumpster and stood there for a minute feeling something I couldn't name. Saturday, I didn't go in. I live alone in a rented half of a duplex about 6 miles from the shop, and I spent Saturday morning doing what I always do, which is nothing, and Saturday afternoon watching the situation get a name. The name they used was the cluster, as in the cluster at Riverbend, then the cluster at 2 other long-term care facilities, then the phrase epidemiologically linked, which nobody explained. A health department woman gave a press conference at 4, and I watched it on my phone standing in my kitchen, and she said the words, "We have no evidence of sustained community transmission." And I remember thinking that was a very careful sentence, and then thinking that careful sentences are what people say when they're being professional, and going back to my sandwich. The part I keep is this. At no point did anyone tell me anything. There was no alert. My phone never buzzed with a state emergency message. Not that Saturday, not Sunday, not ever, actually. I've talked to enough people since to know that some places got them and some places didn't, and nobody knows why. The whole first week of it, everything I learned by looking at things with my own eyes or hearing it secondhand from someone who had. Sunday morning, Dean called me back. He sounded like a man who had been awake a long time. He said, "You still going in tomorrow?" Was planning on it. "Don't take any calls in occupied buildings." "Dean, I make handrails." "I know what you make." He was quiet. "We got sent to Riverbend Thursday afternoon. Their air handler on the memory unit. When we got there, they had the wings shut and a guy from the county standing in the hall, and they wouldn't let my tech pass the doors, and they wanted us to work on the unit from the roof." "Okay." "They wanted us to change the settings so that wing wasn't sharing air with the rest of the building." He let that sit. "I've done containment setups. Isolation rooms, negative pressure, all that. It's normal work. It wasn't the work that got me. It was that the county guy knew exactly what to ask for, and he had it written down. And the paper wasn't from Riverbend." "Meaning what?" "Meaning somebody printed a procedure and drove it around to buildings. Meaning it wasn't the first one." I didn't say anything for a while. He said, "You've got that room in the back." "How do you know about the room?" "Ruthford told me, said you built a jail cell." "It's a tool crib." "Sure," Dean said. "Look, I'm taking Kayla and the boys to her dad's up past Fenwick. If you're smart, you'll stay out of buildings with a lot of people in them, and you'll fill your truck up tonight, not tomorrow." "You think it's that bad?" and he said, "And this is the sentence I've carried around. I think everybody who knows how bad it is has stopped answering the phone." I filled the truck that night. 22 gallons, 380-something a gallon, card worked fine, no line. There were 4 other people at that station and none of us looked at each other. I remember a woman filling 2 red plastic cans in the back of a minivan and thinking, "That's the panicky one," and then thinking, "No, that's the one who's ahead of you." Monday, I went to the shop anyway. Not because I'm brave, because the rail was due, and the food distributor had already paid half, and because when a man has spent 14 years arranging his entire identity around finishing jobs, the collapse of civil order does not immediately outrank a Monday delivery. The strip was empty. 2 cars, and one of them was a Corolla that had been abandoned in the corner spot since June with a flat. I got my door up at 7 and stood there listening. That's when I noticed the highway. You could always hear the interstate from my lot. It's 1.25 miles east, and it makes a sound like a river, constant, so constant you stop hearing it. That morning, it was louder, and it wasn't constant. It came in surges, and under the surges there was a thin, high thread that took me a minute to identify as horns. A lot of horns, far away, layered until they stopped sounding like horns. I stood in my doorway for probably 10 minutes listening to that. Then I went inside, and I did not turn on the radio, and I started moving things into the room. That's the beginning of the part where I looked smart. Here's what I moved in over the next 6 hours, in roughly this order, because I've reconstructed it about 1,000 times. The 4 cases of water from my truck, which I'd never taken out, the canned goods and the rice, my good sleeping bag from the camping tote, the 2-burner propane stove and both bottles, every flashlight in the shop, which was 11, because a shop accumulates flashlights, the first aid kit off the wall, which was mostly Band-Aids and eye wash, my paperwork bin, a 5-gallon bucket, a bag of shop rags, and a box of trash bags, which is not a dignified thing to plan for, but is the thing everybody forgets. Then I did the actual work, which was the door. The room already had the solid door and the drop bar. What it didn't have was a way to see out, and that's because I built it to hide someone from a man who might come looking. I never expected to be inside it wanting information. So I spent 2 hours drilling and mounting a little steel plate over a slot at eye height, a flap you could slide sideways and look through the gap into the shop bay, and I welded a lip so it couldn't be pried. That's the only genuinely smart thing I did that week, and I did it for the wrong reason. I did it because I was bored, and it was a fabrication problem, and fabrication problems are where I go when I'm scared. Around 2 o'clock, a man I didn't know pulled into the lot in a Ford Ranger and got out and looked at my open bay door. I want to describe him accurately because he matters. 50s, heavy in the way that comes from work rather than sitting. Gray beard trimmed close, a polo shirt with a logo I couldn't read. He didn't come toward me. He stood by his truck and called out, "You the metal guy?" "That's me. Ruthford said you might have a compressor." "I do." He nodded and looked at the ground for a second. "I got a mobile home over on Grant, and the water heater's leaking, and I can't get anybody. And I figured if I could blow the line out." He stopped. He rubbed his face. "That's a lie. I don't need a compressor." I put down what I was holding. "I need to not be at my house," he said. "My neighbor's been in his yard since yesterday afternoon." "Doing what?" "Standing." He said it flat. "Standing in the yard. He's got a hose in his hand since yesterday afternoon." I asked if he'd called anybody, which is the reflex, and he said he'd called 4 times, and the last time he got a recording that told him to remain in his residence and monitor official channels. He said he'd asked the recording where the official channels were, which he knew was stupid, and he laughed a little when he said it, and then he stopped laughing. His name was Aldo. He stayed. That's how it started. Not a crowd at a gate. One man who needed somewhere to be and a compressor as an excuse, and I let him stay because he was 50-something and tired, and because I had a room and a bay and a whole lot of square footage and no reason on earth to say no. And because in that specific hour, it cost me nothing. By Wednesday, there were 6 of us. Aldo, Then Ruthford came back for his cabinet shop, which he'd left running, and found the lot the way it was and came over. Then Ruthford's daughter Priya, 26, who worked at a vet clinic that had closed and who arrived with a cat carrier and an apology. Then two guys from the powder coating place at the end of the row, Marcus and a younger man everyone called Tick, who'd been sleeping in the shop for 2 nights already because Marcus's apartment building had lost power Monday night and never got it back. 6 people, 1 bay, 1 16 by 12 room, and 1 man who had spent 3 days in August building a wall and was now, apparently, in charge of something. I need to be honest about what the room actually was in those first days, because this is where the story people tell about me goes wrong. Nobody slept in the room. It was too small and too hot, and there was no reason to. We slept in the bay, on cots and moving blankets and a couch Ruthford dragged over from his break area. The room was where we put the food and the water, and it was where we agreed we'd go if something got into the bay. That's it. It was a lifeboat, not a house. We used it as a pantry with a very good door, and people liked it. That's the thing. People were comforted by it. Aldo went in there twice a day just to look at it. Priya asked me on the second night how long you could stay in there, and I said I hadn't run the numbers. And she said, "But it'd hold, right?" And I said, "The door would hold. The door would hold." That was true. I said a true thing and let her hear a different one. Here's what I knew and didn't say, and it took me until about Thursday to fully know it myself. The room was sealed. Deliberately, carefully sealed, because it had been built so a man standing in my bay couldn't hear a woman breathing inside it. The only air exchange was the window unit near the ceiling, and that unit was wired into the shop panel, and the shop panel was fed from the pole. The sink ran off the building's utility water. The bar fridge, obviously, was electric. If the power went and the door was barred, we would have a 16 by 12 concrete and plywood box with 6 adults in it in late August, in a metal building, in a city where the daytime temperature had not dropped below 91 degrees in 9 days. You do not need a hole in the wall to kill people in a room like that. You just need time and a closed door. I had built a container. I had not built a habitat. Those are 2 completely different products, and I, professionally, of all people, should have known the difference. I build things for a living. I ask clients what the thing is for. I ask about load, about exposure, about maintenance access, and I had built the single most important structure of my life without asking myself one question about what happens on hour 6. So on Thursday, I started fixing it, and that's when the actual shape of the problem showed up. You can't ventilate a room like that from the inside. That's the whole thing. That's the sentence at the center of everything that happened to us. To move air, you need either power or a path, and a path is a hole, and a hole is the thing the room exists to not have. Every solution I sketched on the back of an invoice that Thursday ended in the same place. Somebody has to be outside. Somebody has to run the generator. Somebody has to open the flap. Somebody has to be on the wrong side of my beautiful door. I ran a duct, 4-inch flex, in through a punched port I could plug from inside, out through the block wall to a screened box on the exterior north face, with a little inline fan I stole off a bathroom exhaust unit. It moved air. It moved some air. It ran on 12 volts off a marine battery, and that battery would run the fan for about 2 days, and then somebody had to take it out to the shop and charge it, which meant power, which meant the generator, which meant fuel, which meant going out. I told the others the room had ventilation now, which was true. I did not walk them through the chain. I didn't say, "This room's safety is a rope, and the far end of the rope is tied to a 5-gallon can, and when the can is empty, the room becomes an oven." I told myself I didn't say it because they didn't need the anxiety, and there was nothing they could do with the information. That's the lie I told, and it's not a dramatic lie. It's the ordinary kind. It's the kind where you decide someone else's peace of mind is worth more than their accurate picture of the world, and you get to be the one carrying the accurate picture, which feels like a burden and is actually a kind of ownership. Thursday night, the city lost power on our side of the highway for the first time. Not a blink. 9 hours. It came back at 5 in the morning and went again at 9 and came back at noon. And after that, we stopped tracking it as an event and started tracking it as a resource. Friday, I saw one. I'd been at the shop 8 days by then, and I had heard things and I had believed things secondhand. And there is a specific hollowness that comes from realizing you had been treating the whole thing as a logistics problem. It was late afternoon. I was on the roof of my bay, because I'd gone up to look at the north face duct box, and also, honestly, because from up there you could see the interstate overpass. Ruthford was on the ladder below me, and out on the frontage road, maybe 200 yards off, a person came around the corner of the tire shop and walked up the middle of the road. That's all. A person walking in the road, in daylight, at a completely normal speed. A woman in shorts and one shoe. She wasn't lurching. She wasn't making a sound. She walked the center line like she was following it, and about every 10 steps she stopped and turned her head and stood there for 2 or 3 seconds and then kept going. Ruthford said from the ladder, "Is she hurt?" I said, "I don't know." We watched her for about 4 minutes. She got to the intersection and stopped and stood there. And then a car came through, first car on that road in a day and a half, and she turned toward it, and she went after it. I'm not going to describe that in detail. The car didn't stop and she couldn't catch it, and after it was gone she stood in the intersection for a long time, and then she went back to walking. But the way she moved when she turned toward that car was so completely different from the way she'd been walking that Ruthford made a sound behind me and had to sit down on the ladder rung. She had been quiet and slow for 4 minutes, and then, for maybe 11 seconds, she was not. We went down. Ruthford's hands were shaking so hard he couldn't get the ladder hook loose, and I did it for him. Neither of us said anything to the others for about an hour. And then Priya asked why we were being weird, and Ruthford told her. And then we all stood in the bay with the door down and had the first real conversation we'd had in 8 days. Aldo wanted to close the roll-up permanently and stay in the back. Marcus wanted to leave, go south, get out of the metro entirely. And he had a fair argument, which was that the strip had exactly one road in, and the road ran past 2 apartment complexes. Tick, who was maybe 23, and had said almost nothing all week, said his mother was in Bellhaven and he was going to go get her, and Marcus said with what vehicle, and Tick said with his, and Marcus said you've got a quarter tank and there is no gas. And Priya said, how long can we stay in the room? Everybody looked at me. This is the moment. Everything before this is set up and everything after is consequence. And I have thought about the 4 or 5 seconds between her question and my answer more than I have thought about any other 4 seconds of my life. I could have said, about 4 hours with the door barred and no power, and then it becomes dangerous. And I don't know exactly when it becomes fatal because I have never tested it, and I'm not going to. What I said was, it depends what we're going in there for. Which is not a lie. It's a real answer. It's the answer an engineer gives, and it landed on that group of scared people as reassurance, because it sounded like a man with a framework, and they took it that way, and I watched them take it that way, and I did not correct them. Aldo said, so if it's a night, we're fine. And I said, if it's a night, we'd want the generator running. Which is also true, and which was the closest I came, that day, to telling them the actual shape of it. And Aldo heard we'd want as a preference rather than a requirement, and nodded, and went to bed happier. I want to be clear that I didn't lose sleep over it at the time. That's the ugly part. At the time, it felt like management. I'd been a small employer for 14 years, and I had a whole set of habits about what you tell people and what you carry. And those habits are not evil. They're just built for a world where the worst outcome is a missed deadline. The generator was a Honda I'd bought used for job sites, 5,000 watts, and it drank about half a gallon an hour under real load. I had 11 gallons in cans and whatever was in the vehicles. Aldo's Ranger had most of a tank. My truck had 22 gallons in it, minus the drive-in. Priya's little car had a half, Marcus's had a quarter, and Tick's had less. Call it 80 gallons of gasoline in the entire strip, and about 70 of it inside fuel tanks I'd need a pump and a hose to get at. And I want to say clearly that I'm not going to walk through how we got fuel out of those tanks. Because that's not the point, and because it's not the kind of thing I'm going to explain. It took a whole day, and it was miserable. And Tick, who turned out to have a real talent for it, did most of the work and got sick from it. 80 gallons sounds like a lot. At half a gallon an hour, it's 160 hours of generator. Except you don't run a generator constantly. You run it to charge things and to run the well of whatever you need. And we needed the shop's chest freezer for 4 days until we gave up on it, and the battery bank for the fan, and Priya's insulin oil. Not insulin. I'm conflating stories. Priya didn't have anything. Priya was fine. Ruthford was the one with the pills, blood pressure, and something for his heart rhythm. And he had a bottle and a half, and he never once mentioned it until it was almost gone. That's a whole separate thing that I'll get to. 80 gallons. And the second I had the number, I understood that the number was the room. The room's real specification was not solid door or block walls. The room's real specification was safe for as long as one man is willing to stand outside it in the dark refueling a generator. And that man was going to be me, because I built it, and because nobody else really knew the panel, and because this is the part that took me longest to admit, because being needed was the only thing I had left that felt like the old world. The water went out on the 11th day. It didn't announce itself. Priya turned the tap in the room's little sink and got a cough of air and a brown dribble and then nothing. Ruthford tried the hose bib outside and got the same. Somewhere upstream, a pump station had lost power for the last time, or a main had broken and nobody was coming, or the treatment plant had run out of the chemical it runs out of. We never found out. I don't think anybody ever told anybody anything that entire month. We had, at that point, 3 of the 4 cases I'd brought, plus 18 gallons in jugs we'd filled the first week when I'd had the sense to fill jugs, plus the water heater in Ruthford's shop and the one in mine, which is 40 gallons apiece if you're careful about how you drain it, and which is a genuinely useful thing that most people forget about, plus a chest freezer half full of thawing ice, 6 adults, late August, a metal building. You use about a gallon a day per person if you are being disciplined and not washing anything, and more if it's 94 degrees, and it was 94 degrees. So the arithmetic changed shape. It stopped being about the room. It became about the fact that everything we needed, water, fuel, food beyond the rice, was outside, and the room's entire purpose was to be a place you go when outside is unsurvivable. I built a thing that only works if you never need it for long. Aldo figured it out before anybody else. Not all of it. He didn't do the heat math, but he got the shape of it, because he'd lived in a mobile home for 20 years and understood in his body that a small box in summer is a hostile object. He came to me on the 12th night while I was running the generator behind the building with a blanket over it to muffle it, which is a stupid thing to do to a generator, and which I did anyway. He said, "If we go in there and something's in the bay, how do we come back out?" I said we'd wait until it left. He said, "What if it doesn't leave?" And I gave him a real answer, finally. I said, "Then we come out anyway, in about 6 hours, and we deal with whatever's out here, because in 6 hours the room is worse than the bay." Aldo took that better than I expected. He was quiet for a bit, and then he said, "You should tell everybody that. It'll scare them. They're already scared. Right now, they're scared and wrong." He picked at the paint on the generator handle. My wife died in a hospital that had a plan. Every wall had a sign with a plan on it. Nobody ever told me what any of it meant, and I sat there for 9 days feeling stupid. He looked up. "Don't do that to these people." I said I'd think about it. I did think about it. I thought about it for 4 days, and I didn't do it. And here is exactly why, and I want to lay it out, because I think it's the most honest thing in this whole account. If I told them the room had a 6-hour clock, the room stopped being a solution and became a delay. And if it was a delay, then Marcus was right, and we should leave. And if we left, I had no idea where we were going, and I would go from being the man who built the room to a middle-aged guy with a truck and no plan. I didn't hold the information to protect them. I held it because it was the only thing that made me the person to ask. That's it. That's the whole moral center of this story. And it isn't heroic, and it isn't monstrous. It's just a man who wanted to keep his standing. On the 14th day, 3 people came up the road. We'd had the roll-up door down for a week and were using the walk-in on the side, which had a view of the gravel through a wired glass panel. Tick was on watch. We'd started doing watch, badly, informally, 2-hour shifts nobody enforced, and he came and got me. A man, a woman, and a girl who was maybe 9. They had a garden wagon with jugs in it. They were walking the frontage road in the open, in the middle of the afternoon, which by then was insane, and they were doing it because the girl couldn't move fast and there was no other way to move a wagon. They stopped at the mouth of our lot. The man cupped his hands and shouted, "Is anybody using the hydrant?" That's what he asked. Not for shelter, not for food. He'd seen the fire hydrant at the corner of our lot, and he wanted to know if we'd already tapped it. Ruthford opened the walk-in door before anybody voted on it, which is the kind of thing Ruthford did, and shouted back that the water was out everywhere and the hydrant was flat, and the man's shoulders went down, and the woman crouched next to the girl and said something to her. And then we had a problem, because the door was open and they'd been told a true thing and they were still standing there. I went out. I remember the gravel through my boots and how loud it was. I got to about 20 feet from them and stopped. And they stopped too, and everybody understood the 20 feet without discussing it, which was a new and awful kind of manners we'd all learned in 2 weeks. The man's name was Emery. He'd been walking since Belhaven, which is where Tick's mother was, and Tick heard the name and made a sound, and he said Belhaven was gone in the specific way people meant that word then, which was not destroyed, but no longer a place with anything in it. He said the county had set up something at the fairgrounds south of the river on the 8th day, and it had stopped taking people on the 11th. He said there was a National Guard element at the river bridges, but they weren't blocking. They were counting, and he didn't know why they were counting. He said, "We're not asking to come in. We're asking where water is." I stood there in my own gravel lot and did the math out loud in my head, and I want to describe what the math actually was, because it wasn't about generosity. We had roughly 100 gallons if you counted the water heaters, and 6 people, and no resupply. 3 more people is a 50% increase in draw. That's 12 days becoming 8. That's not a rounding error. But the number I actually stalled on wasn't the water. It was the room. 16 by 12. 6 people in there was already too many. 9 was not a number the room could hold at all. Not even for the 6 hours. Not even for 2. And that meant that letting them in required me to say out loud in front of everybody that the room had a capacity. And a capacity implies a duration, and a duration means somebody's going to ask me what the duration is. I could not let them in without telling the truth. That's how it actually presented itself. Not as compassion versus supplies, as compassion versus my own credibility. I said, "There's a creek behind the industrial park. It's low, but it's running. You'd have to boil it." Emery said, "With what?" Which was fair. And I went inside and got the smaller propane bottle and the little single burner and a pot from Ruthford's break area, and I set them on the gravel and backed off, and the woman came and got 'em. And that was it. That's what I did. I gave 3 people a camp stove and a direction, and I let them walk away in the afternoon heat with a 9-year-old. And I told myself I'd made a resource decision. And I had not. I'd made a reputation decision. I've never told anybody that until now. They went. Tick asked Emery about a facility in Belhaven, and Emery said he didn't know, and Tick asked twice more with the same words, and Emery said, gently, "I don't know, son." And then they went. Tick left the next morning. He took his car with its quarter tank and about a gallon of our water, and he didn't say goodbye to anybody except Priya, who he woke up to tell. Marcus was furious for a day and then stopped talking about it entirely, and I understood that Marcus had wanted to go with him and hadn't. I want to slow down here and describe what daily life actually was, because the dramatic parts are the least true parts. We got up at first light because it was cooler. We did not run the generator in daylight because of the noise. The bay's roll-up stayed down. We used the walk-in and the back man door, and we had a rule about not both being open at once, which we broke constantly. Priya took care of her cat, whose name was Bishop, and the cat lived in the room, which everybody agreed was fine, and which meant the room permanently smelled like a litter box. And that detail bothered me more than it should have because it was my room and it was supposed to be clean. Ruthford did the food. He was 61 and had cooked for a family of 5 for 30 years, and he could do things with rice and canned tomato that made the day feel structured. He'd portion it out into 6 mismatched bowls, and we'd sit on upturned buckets and eat and mostly not talk. That was dinner. It was often the only time we were all in the same place. Aldo walked the strip twice a day, checking the other bays. He found things. A vending machine in Bay 2 with about $40 of food in it, which we got into with a pry bar and a bad conscience. 11 gallons of distilled water in the powder coating shop that turned out to be fine to drink. A first aid cabinet in Bay 9, mostly intact, that had actual gauze and actual tape. Marcus fixed the fan when it burned out. He rewound something, and I still don't know what he did. And I did what I've always done. I fabricated. I made a better cover for the duct port. I made a bar for the walk-in door. I made a stand so the generator could sit further from the building. I made a rack for the water jugs. I made, over 4 days, an entire second door for the room's exterior side, which nobody needed, and which I built because I could not sit still. Every one of those things was useful. None of them addressed the actual problem, which was that we had a shrinking amount of water and fuel in a city that had stopped being supplied, and we had no plan for what came after the numbers hit 0. I was doing the fabrication equivalent of arranging deck chairs, except I was very good at it, and everybody watched me work and felt better. And the feeling better was itself a kind of cost, because it bought us all another week of not deciding anything. The thing I did not build in all that time was any way to leave. Day 19, Ruthford's pills ran out. He told me at breakfast, in the flat voice of a man who'd rehearsed it. Blood pressure medication and an antiarrhythmic. He'd been splitting them for a week and a half, which he also hadn't told anyone. I asked what happens. He said, probably nothing for a while. Then maybe something. Priya knew more than she wanted to say vet clinic, not human medicine, but enough. She got very quiet, and later she pulled me aside and told me that the specific thing he was on, you don't just stop, and that there's a rebound effect, and that she wasn't a doctor and couldn't tell me a number. So then we had a reason to go out. And here's the thing. I need you to understand about that. We were glad. All 4 of us, at some level, were glad. 19 days of arithmetic and rationing and heat and listening, and finally there was a problem with a shape and a destination. Marcus was practically animated. I caught myself planning routes with something that felt disturbingly like enjoyment. There were 3 pharmacies within 4 miles. There was also the vet clinic where Priya had worked, which she said would have some overlapping drugs and which she had keys to, and which was 6 miles the wrong direction. We went to the nearest pharmacy first, Marcus and me, in my truck on day 20, at 5:40 in the morning. I'd like to tell you it was harrowing. Mostly it was strange. The roads were empty and clear. That's what nobody tells you, that in the first month the roads are not choked with wrecks. They're just empty. And the emptiness is worse. Traffic lights were dark at 3 intersections and working at 2. And we stopped at the working ones out of pure habit, both of us, and then looked at each other. We saw 4 people. 2 were far off and moving normally, and we didn't approach. One was a man sitting on a curb with a dog, who watched us drive past and lifted 2 fingers off his knee, and I have thought about that man 100 times. And one was in a Walgreens parking lot and was not normal, and Marcus said, "Don't slow down," and I didn't. The pharmacy had been opened, not smashed open, with the lock drilled professionally, which suggested somebody with tools and forethought. Inside, the front of the store was mostly untouched. Snacks, drinks, shampoo. The pharmacy counter was cleaned out of everything behind the counter in the controlled cabinet, and had almost everything else still on the shelves in white bottles, because whoever came through was looking for one category, and I understood exactly which one. We got the blood pressure medication, 2 full bottles of it generic, and I stood there in the dark with a flashlight in my teeth, reading tiny print and feeling something enormous and unexpected, which was relief so strong it made my hands unsteady. We did not get the antiarrhythmic. Not there, not at the second one either, which we hit on the way back because we were greedy, and because it had felt easy. The second one is where it stopped being easy. There were people in it, 3 or 4, with lights, and they were not infected. They were just people, and one of them shouted at us before we got to the door. Not threats, just, "We're in here," and Marcus put his hand on my arm, and we backed off and got in the truck and drove away. And nobody did anything to anybody, and my heart went for 20 minutes anyway. We came back with the water we'd grabbed off the shelves, 28 bottles, which felt like a fortune, and 2 bottles of Ruthford's pills and a bag of candy for Priya that I'd taken on impulse and that made her cry, which I did not expect and did not handle well. That night we ran the generator and everybody stood around it like it was a fire. Day 22, the power came back for 6 hours and then went and did not come back again, ever, as far as I know. Day 24, we heard vehicles on the frontage road at night, more than one, moving fast, and lay in the dark, listening. Day 26 is when the thing came into the bay. I'm going to tell this plainly because dressing it up would be obscene. We had gotten sloppy about the 2-door rule. Marcus had propped the back man door because the bay was intolerable. It was 96 that day, and a metal building in 96 is an object with intent, and he'd gone out front to the shade side of the building, and the back door stood open onto the weeded strip behind the strip, and something came through it. Priya saw it first. She was closest, sorting cans on the floor near the room, and she said a word I didn't hear, and then she said loud, "In here, in here, in here." 4 of us got into the room in maybe 20 seconds. Ruthford was slowest, and Aldo pulled him through the doorway, hard enough to bruise his arm badly. Priya had Bishop, who she scooped without thinking, and who scratched her open across the wrist. The bar dropped. The door held. Of course the door held. It was the best thing I ever built. It was 4:15 in the afternoon. Marcus was outside. Here's what the next hours actually were, and if you're waiting for a fight, there isn't one. We slid the flap and looked. It was a man in a filthy quilted flannel, and he moved around my bay in a way that had no pattern I could read. He knocked over a rack. He stopped in front of my bench for a long time, minutes, many minutes, completely still, facing the wall. Then he'd move again. Marcus outside did the smart thing. He got in Aldo's Ranger and stayed in it, low, and he did not try to come in. And in the room, the temperature started to climb. 6 people is the number the room can't take, and we were 4 plus a cat. And the fan was running off the marine battery, and it was moving air, but the air it was moving was 96-degree air from the north face. And the 4 of us were producing heat, and the walls of a plywood and block box in a metal building in August do not radiate anything away. They store it. At 5 o'clock, it was uncomfortable. At 6, it was bad. Ruthford sat on the floor with his back against the block, which was the coolest surface, and his breathing changed in a way that made Priya move over next to him and stay there. We had 4 bottles of the pharmacy water inside because I'd been careless about where things got stored, and we drank 3 of them in the first 2 hours because you can't not. At 6:30, Aldo said, "How long?" And I said the number. Finally. 26 days too late, and in the worst possible circumstances, I said, "We should be out by 10. Ruthford should be out by 8. And Aldo, who had known, nodded. And Priya said, "Out by 8 or what?" And I told her, all of it. The chain, no power, no compressor, no real ventilation. The fan is a gesture, the walls hold heat. The door is the only thing here that works. I told her the room was a place to be for 4 hours, and I'd never said so, and I'd let her believe otherwise since the 2nd week. She didn't yell. I would have preferred yelling. She looked at me for a second and then turned back to Ruthford and put a wet rag on the back of his neck and said to him, "Not me. Okay, 8 o'clock. Ruthford, who by then was gray and not talking much, said, "It's a good door, though." We got out at 8:40, not through cleverness. Marcus, from the Ranger, had spent 3 hours working out that the thing in my bay reacted to noise, but only close noise. And at 8:30, he drove the Ranger up to the roll-up door and laid on the horn for 10 seconds, and then backed off 50 feet. And it came out through the walk-in after him, and he drove out to the frontage road slow enough to be followed, and led it away like you'd lead a dog off a porch. He came back an hour later on foot from the other direction. It took him 40 minutes to do the last 200 yards. That's the rescue. A guy with a truck horn and patience. Not the room. The room was the thing that kept us alive for 4.5 hours and would have started killing Ruthford somewhere around 6. Ruthford was not okay. He wasn't dead and he wasn't fine. He was disoriented for most of the next day, and his heart was doing something Priya didn't like. And we had the blood pressure medication and not the other one. And he leveled out over about 4 days into a version of himself that was slower and smaller. He kept saying the door had held. He said it like a compliment, and I could not stand hearing it. Priya's wrist got infected, the cat scratch of all things, in a month with no hospital, and we spent 11 days worried about that with the gauze from Bay 9 and some cephalexin from the vet clinic run, which she said was fine and which I hope was fine. Nobody said anything about what I'd withheld. Not once, and Aldo and I never discussed it again. Priya was cordial with me from then on, in a way that was worse than anger, and I do not blame her, and I have never asked her to feel differently. What changed was that the room stopped being the plan. That's the whole back half of what happened to us, in one sentence. On day 27, we sat on our buckets, and Marcus laid out what he'd been thinking for a month, and nobody argued. And I sat there and listened to a man take over something I'd never officially been in charge of and felt, honestly, mostly relief. And under the relief, a small, mean thing I'm not proud of, which was, they don't need me now. Marcus's plan was not brilliant. It was just correct. There was a water tower 2 miles north serving a subdivision, and a lot of houses in that subdivision with water heaters full of 40 gallons apiece, and gas in the tanks of cars and driveways. And the whole reason we were bleeding out was that we had been sitting in a place with no resources defending a room, when a mile away there were 400 empty houses, each containing a small amount of everything. We moved on day 31, not to a fortress, to a 2-story house in that subdivision with a walkout basement and a wood-burning fireplace and a neighbor's above-ground pool full of green water we could filter and boil. I want to be exact about what I lost, because that's the ending, such as it is. I took the tools I could carry and I left everything else. I left the welder, the plasma cutter, the drill press, the mill I'd bought at auction and rebuilt over 2 winters. 14 years of a business, and the leftovers of 41 jobs and a cabinet of drawings. And I left the room. I stood in it for a minute before we went, in the smell of cat and sweat and hot plywood, and looked at the frame I'd welded, 4 hinges and the slot with the sliding plate, and the drop bar in its brackets. Genuinely good work. Nobody who ever saw it thought otherwise. I'd built it in 3 days in August to hide 1 woman from 1 man, and it would have been perfect for that. It would have held Corinne all night with the AC running and the shop lights off and a man in the lot outside. And in the morning she'd have walked out and it would have been the best thing I ever did. Instead, it held 4 adults and a cat for 4.5 hours and nearly cooked a 61-year-old man. Because the thing I hadn't built was everything around it. Here's what I know now that I didn't know then, and it isn't wisdom. It's just the shape of the mistake. A shelter is not an object. It's an object plus a supply, plus a person outside who's still willing. Take away any one of those, and you have a very well-made box. I sold the box to 5 people as if it were the whole thing, because the box was the part I could make, and because being the man who made it was the last recognizable version of myself available to me. We've been in the house 6 weeks. It's not safe. It's quieter than the Strip, and the basement stays 68 degrees, no matter what the day does, which is a thing I didn't build and didn't earn, and which has done more for us than anything I've ever fabricated. There are 11 of us now, some people from 3 streets over, and a woman with 2 kids who came through in October and stayed. Marcus decides most things. Ruthford cooks when he's up to it. Aldo went south in September to look for a cousin and hasn't come back and probably isn't coming. I make things. Bars for doors. A hand pump linkage that mostly works. A rack. A stand. People are grateful, and I let them be grateful. And it's not the same as before, because now when somebody asks me if something will hold, I tell them exactly what it will hold, and for how long, and what has to be true outside for it to keep being true inside. It takes longer to explain. Sometimes they stop listening in the middle. Priya still has the cat. Bishop got out in November and came back 3 days later, thinner, and she cried about it in a way she hadn't cried about anything else, and I understood that. I think about Emery and the woman and the 9-year-old with the wagon about as often as I think about anything. I gave them a camp stove and pointed at a creek. There was room in the bay. There was not room in the room, and I'd decided the room was the point, and the reason I'd decided that was that I'd made it. I don't know what happened to them. I could go look. The creek is 4 miles from here, and there are places along it people might have stopped. I've thought about walking down there in the spring. I probably won't.